NonProfit HelpDesk session on how to start a 501c3 nonprofit organization. My name is Amy Fiore. I am the new director of the NonProfit HelpDesk, and it is absolutely my pleasure to present this for all of you this afternoon and to be in this role. Few housekeeping things and things that we'd like for you to know as we are getting started. This is the NonProfit HelpDesk. It is a program of the JCC of Greater Coney Island. And we offer a handful of things to New York City nonprofits, and we do it with absolute pleasure. Those things are all available on our website at nphd.nonprofithelpdesk.org. That includes free workshops on all sorts of capacity building issues, concerns, interest levels for nonprofits in New York City. We also offer free expert support. So if you are watching one of these sessions and you need a little bit more information, or we have not yet offered a workshop on something that would really be helpful to your organization, we want to hear from you. We want to be able to help if we can. At nphd.org, there is a button to click so that you can request some help on your specific topic. We want to hear from you if we can. And lastly, we have updated and started building a LinkedIn community. So please look for the NonProfit Help Desk on LinkedIn. We have some upcoming workshops that we hope you will join us for. We have one next week about how small nonprofits make big news. In mid to late January, we have Harnessing AI for Good. And then if you aren't tired of my voice yet, in early February, I will be doing a workshop on a better way to get your board to fundraise. In and amongst all of those, our schedule is going to fill up very, very quickly with workshops on discretionary funding from New York City Council members. We're going to talk about who is eligible and whether or not it's the right option for you, how to go about getting discretionary funding, capital funding. We are working on some cultural workshops for discretionary funding as well. So keep an eye out in your email. Keep visiting us at nphd.org to find some more information about that. And lastly, as I mentioned before, we are a help desk and we want to be able to help. So complete the form at nphd.org. With all that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can get straight to the fantastic topic that you are all here to see. It is my pleasure to introduce Yisrael Schulman, who I'm going to make a host at this moment. Hang on one quick second. There we go. And Mr. Schulman, I hand the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, Amy. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. So my name is Yisrael Schulman, and for the better part, since 1987, I have been involved in providing legal services to individuals in a whole host of variety of areas, and also, and more relevant for today, providing legal services for nonprofits, helping individuals who have a dream or an idea, flush that idea out and the dream out, and actually do the legal work necessary to become a New York State not-for-profit, and to apply to the Internal Revenue Service for that all-important 501c3 letter so that you can accept charitable donations and so that you're eligible to apply for city grants, such as what Amy mentioned, discretionary grants and capital grants, both not just from the city, but from the state as well, from private foundations and public charities, et cetera, and really helping nonprofits with everything from A to Z, whether it's incorporating, helping with the IRS status, helping with create policies for employees, helping with property tax issues, sales tax issues, anything with it that a not-for-profit from A to Z would need help with is really what I focused my practice on for the better part of the last, a number of decades. And I've been very pleased to be a consulting attorney with the NonProfit Help Desk, which, as mentioned, is a project of the JCC GCI. And for those interested in accessing legal services, as Amy mentioned, there's a form on the nphd.org and maybe Ina will put, or maybe I don't know, maybe I will if I can. We'll put that into the chat just so everyone has that. I'm not sure I know how to do that actually. Let me see if I can do it. Yeah, I'm just going to
I was
write
able
that
to
in.
do it. It's right there for them.
Oh, it is? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see. Hold on. PowerPoint presentation. And let me just get this ready. Okay, great. So what we're going to talk about today is nonprofits. Can everyone, first off, just a technical question. Ina or Amy, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we see it. Perfect.
Okay. So I think just another technical matter. I'd like to go through the entire PowerPoint presentation because I think that some of the questions you may have as I'm going through this may be answered as we get to additional slides and additional parts, portions of the presentation. So I guess I would ask that if you have a question and you're afraid you won't remember it, because I will take questions at the end, I promise. I guess what you can do is you can type it into the chat, because everyone has access to that, so that you don't forget the question. And at the end, with some help from Ina, we'll go through and we'll make sure that we address and answer all your questions. Am I supposed to be doing the admitting, guys? Because it says
No,
am
we'll
I the one
take
that
care
does
of that for you.
what?
We'll take care of that for you.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So right from the start, how to form a nonprofit organization. So the first question, see if I can, 1 second, please. The first question one really has to think about. Let's see if I can change the size just a little bit so we can get more of it on one page. Hold on, please. Yeah, perfect. The first thing we really need to think about is whether or not is this too small, folks? Amy or Ina, is this a good size or bigger?
I think it looks okay.
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. Is whether or not you should form a nonprofit. Everyone thinks about, oh, I have a great idea for a charity. I have a great idea for a project. And immediately one thinks, I need to form a nonprofit organization and I need to apply for 501c3 status. And sometimes people don't realize that when you create a nonprofit organization, it's not just about creating the nonprofit organization. It's also about maintaining the nonprofit organization and doing what's necessary on an annual basis, on a consistent basis, to make sure that your nonprofit organization remains in good status, both with the state of New York and with the Internal Revenue Service. So the first thing I want to say is that in not all instances is it prudent, is it a good idea, a great idea to start a nonprofit organization. Sometimes one can consider, sorry guys, one can consider something called fiscal sponsorship. Okay, and what is fiscal sponsorship? Fiscal sponsorship means that I have a great idea. I want to raise money because I want to provide food for people in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and because there's a crisis going on there right now, whatever it is. But I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to be doing this long term. I'm not sure I want to be involved with the administration of actually collecting the money and issuing receipts. So I look for a partner. I look for an already existing charitable organization that's out there. And I approached that charity, and there are lots of charities. Brooklyn and New York City in general is blessed with one of the largest per capita numbers of nonprofits, all of which are doing wonderful work in our communities. And many of them may have, and there may be nonprofits out there which have a similar mission to what you hope to accomplish. Just by way of example, last year we had somebody contact us and they wanted to do sports recreational programs in Queens for youth. And they wanted to do a soccer league and football for boys and softball for and other sports for girls and women as well. And after speaking with myself and others at the NonProfit HelpDesk, they actually were able to identify a nonprofit in Queens which has as its mission providing recreational services for youth, and they actually partnered with them at least initially, through a fiscal sponsorship agreement where they're running their own program as a project of the existing nonprofit in Queens. And they decided that was a wise idea for them. First off, they weren't sure if their idea was going to take off, if they were going to be able to raise the funds necessary to sustain the programs. And they weren't sure, and they just wanted to give it, just to test it out, so to speak, and to see whether or not they actually raised funds. They were thrilled with the idea of not having to, to worry about issuing receipts, not having to worry about, providing an annual report to the New York State Attorney General's office, which we'll talk about later on in this presentation, filing a tax return with the United States Internal Revenue Service, which we'll also talk about later on. So for them, fiscal sponsorship worked out a great idea. So we talk about testing out new ideas, getting help with the administration, and the project essentially becomes, your project essentially becomes one of the fiscal sponsors, one of the fiscal sponsoring nonprofits programs, where the fiscal sponsor receives the donations and grants for the project, and they issue the receipts. Depending upon the arrangement you make with the fiscal sponsor, we did one 2 years ago with a food program that partnered with a local church. The church is the fiscal sponsor for the program, and the church receives the monetary donations and issues receipts. They charge a very small administrative fee to the fiscal project for their work, which they're doing. But so far, it's been it's a two-year model, and it's been working. And they entered an agreement, and of course, the agreement can be terminated by either side with a certain number of days. And for them, that's working out. Now, when is a nonprofit organization a great option? Well, obviously, one option would be is if you can't find a fiscal sponsor. You can't find a fiscal sponsor, then then your only option, if you want to be able to raise charitable funds and issue tax receipts and have access to government monies, is to actually open your own nonprofit organization where you have your own directors. You're able to apply for tax-exempt status from the IRS. There are some issues to consider with fiscal sponsorship. You have obviously less control over the project. That's all negotiated together with the fiscal sponsor as to exactly what kind of control you'll have over the project. It can be difficult sometimes to find a sponsor. That can be time-consuming. It can be time-consuming. Maybe you want to start faster and maybe it's going to be more difficult for you to find a fiscal sponsor with a similar mission. And also as I noted a few moments ago, the relationship doesn't have to be permanent with the fiscal sponsor. Oftentimes, we have found in the nonprofit help desk that projects that individuals who have ideas are able to find a fiscal sponsor, and as the idea grows and develops, and more funds are raised, they then convert themselves and they actually incorporate and become a nonprofit organization, and they go through the process of becoming an independent legal entity with its own independent board of directors as a project which has a fiscal sponsoring organization. You generally don't have your own independent board of directors. You may have what's called an advisory board, people who are helping you come up with ideas for the program and for the fiscal sponsorship program. Now, I'm going to go through the steps of, from A to Z of creating and operating a New York State nonprofit. So the first thing you have to do is you have to come up with a name for your nonprofit. It's important, I always recommend, I'm not a branding expert and marketing person, and there are people involved in the nonprofit help desk who do have that expertise, but I always feel that your name should say something. The name of your organization should somehow indicate who, the connection to the organization. So if you're providing food relief in Bed-Stuyvesant, it may be, the Food Relief Project or the Food Relief Program of Bed-Stuyvesant, Inc. In New York State, a nonprofit, it has to end with either Inc., Limited, CORP, some type of suffix at the end of it. Now, it used to be in the old time, prior to everything being, so computerized, that if you had a name, if you thought of a name for a corporation, you would submit your name to the New York State Division of Corporations and do what's called a name search, where you would see whether or not that name is already taken. Because you can't have two organizations in New York State in most instances with the exact same name. Now it's very simple. If you literally just go to the website of the New York State Department of State Division of Corporations, you can do an entity search. You can put in your desired name, and you can see if anyone's already using that name in New York State or a similar name to it. Now that only tells you state. It doesn't tell you county-wise, because as we'll talk about in a moment, there are, for at least in the context of religious corporations, if anyone is interested in creating a religious corporation, those are done on the county level, and those are not, that database is not computerized. So you won't know whether or not, if you're creating a religious corporation, if somebody else is using your name in a specific county, unless you actually go to the county and actually go to the county clerk's office and do a search in that manner. But I'm assuming most people on this, in this presentation are interested in ordinary nonprofit corporations, regular not-for-profit corporations incorporated into the New York State not-for-profit corporation law and not the New York State religious corporations law. And for those types of entities, you're able to literally go online to the Division of Corporations and do a name search. So the first thing is to come up with a name. The next, as I sort of alluded to, New York State offers two types of nonprofit corporations. First is the religious corporations, so if you're establishing a church or a synagogue or a mosque or something, or something with a religious purpose, you have the option of forming a corporation not through the state, but using the county, but through the county, simply by creating papers, filling out proper documentation and forms, and filing those with the county clerk's office in order to establish your religious corporation. If it's a non-religious corporation, then we're talking about the New York State not-for-profit corporation law. It used to be that charities were categorized, but via letter. Now, as a result of the nonprofit type A, type B, type C, type D, now they've all been merged together under the New York State Not-for-Profit Revitalization Act, so that the charitable and non-charitable corporations, charitable, which is I'm assuming what most people here are referring to, are educational charities, religious, scientific, religious, but not houses of worship, scientific, literary, cultural, and animal welfare, recreational. Those would all be what we call charitable. Okay. Now, certain types. The next step is to ascertain whether or not your nonprofit requires any type of state administrative approval in order to incorporate. So, for instance, if I want to operate a daycare and I want to start a not-for-profit daycare center, the incorporation is done through the New York State Division of Corporations. It's under the nonprofit corporation law. But the New York State Division of Corporations will not authorize the filing of your certificate of incorporation unless you have fulfilled right over here, you see, and you've gotten what's called a consent from the Office of Children and Family Services. And what that means is they have their own form. You fill out a form. You can sometimes there's a small filing fee to get that consent. You either file it online or you mail it in. They mail back what's called a consent, and it says we, the Office of Children and Family Services, or we, the Department of Health, or the Department of Education, etc., consent to the filing of your certificate of incorporation with the New York State Division of Corporations. Now, the vast majority of nonprofits do not require a governmental agency consent, but and on the state website, once again, it tells you the type of not-for-profit and which require a governmental consent. Hold on, I'm getting a message. Okay, good. And when we file the incorporation, I mean, if you're doing it through the NonProfit HelpDesk, which is a service which we offer, you can request that service once again by going to nphd.org and filling out the proper form. But if you're not using us and you somehow are doing it on your own and you file something that requires a governmental approval, what will happen is they'll reject it and they'll send you back a letter. This is the New York State Division of Corporations, and in the letter they'll say you need the following consent. We're holding on to your papers and your filing fee until you obtain that type of consent. So you can see the list here of the types of things which do require, governmental consent. If it's a substance abuse program, if you're creating some type of facility for the disabled, you may need OPWDD consent, etc. Okay. So what we've gone through so far is as follows. We've said you select your name for your corporation. You select whether or not it's going to be filed under the nonprofit corporation law or the religious corporations law. And then you've determined whether or not you need any type of governmental consent. So the next step is we're now ready to pay our $75 filing fee, plus an optional expediting fee, which I always recommend. And we're ready to prepare and file the articles of incorporation. Okay. It is done. It can be done now via fax, which is the most common way attorneys do it, or you can mail it in. The filing fee is $75. If you're happen to be in the Albany area, you can actually drop it off there. But assuming most people here in the city or near the city, most of you would be doing it via fax. I always recommend an expediting fee. If you don't use an expediting fee, in my experience, you pay your $75 and you wait, good 4 to 6 weeks before you get back any word from them. If you use a filing fee, if you do the optional filing fee of, let's say, $25, it's 24 hours later. It's the next business day. $75 gets you the exact same day, and 2 hours, after receipt of the facsimile is $150. Okay, you can pay by credit card, etc. Now, the next step is, let's do a little sidebar here. Let's talk about what has to be in your articles of incorporation. In your articles of incorporation, you have to specify, it's best to specify a short purpose statement. It could be 1 or 2 lines. We always like to add in there as well that you're authorized to do any other act authorized under the nonprofit corporation law. So for instance, using my example of providing of food in Bed-Stuy. The mission of the corporation is to alleviate hunger through the provision of food in the Bed-Stuy Brooklyn, and community in community areas. In addition, this non-for-profit organization is authorized to provide any other service or program as authorized under the New York State not-for-profit corporation law. And the reason we do that is because if you don't have a statement like that, believe it or not, in 3 years, when you've decided that this wonderful charity that you have, you want to do something else, you want to expand the mission, you want to provide, you want to provide, a thrift store, or free clothing or cash assistance for the needy. You don't want to have to go back to the state and to amend your certificate of incorporation, because amendments are actually harder than the initial filing. Because with an amendment to a certificate of incorporation that involves the purpose of the nonprofit, you have to obtain the approval of the New York State Attorney General's office. And while they grant that approval, as long as it's a bona fide purpose, it can take many months. Many months. We've had them as long as 6 to 8 months for the New York State Attorney General's office to approve the amendment of the purpose. And then, of course, once we get the approval from the New York State Office of the Attorney General, we then can almost immediately get file the certificate of incorporation. That's why it's important to have in your certificate of incorporation as expansive a purpose as possible, or some kind of general provision that authorizes the nonprofit to provide any other service as authorized under New York State law. You also have to list your initial incorporators of the corporation. That can change. Let's go on. Okay. You also have to have what's called a registered agent. So that would mean that would mean where it is that in the unlikely event that your not-for-profit needs to receive service of process, means somebody is suing your not-for-profit, you have to identify in your certificate of incorporation where the nonprofit can be reached and where New York State, the Secretary of State, can contact. What is the official address of the nonprofit? That does not mean that you have to rent an office for that. It doesn't mean that you have to rent a PO box from that. In most nonprofits, which are at least with which we're involved, that are just starting out, I actually say use one of the officers, use one of your initial corporators' address initially until you're able to rent space, or maybe you'll never rent space, and that's okay. So it can be the address of one of the board members or one of the incorporators of the nonprofit. That can serve as the address for where service of process, which is just a fancy way of saying, service of any kind of legal paper, service process, any kind of legal paper. So you have to have that address in the certificate of incorporation. Okay, so we've talked about so far establishing the nonprofit. You get your name, you determine which provision of law you're filing under, you've determined whether or not you need any governmental approvals, you've determined that you're going to file your certificate of incorporation. You should have a brief mission statement. We try to make it as expansive as possible, the certificate of incorporation, so that you can provide other types of services, which may arise, or which you may think about, or your board may think about in the future. You identify a business address. You identify your initial three directors or 3 incorporators. You can have 1 incorporator and then later on identify your directors. I always like to say right from the start, let's figure out who your 3 initial directors are going to be, because it is a requirement in New York State, as I'll talk about in a moment, to have at least 3 initial directors. So we then have waited our 24 hours or 72 hours, whatever it is, and we have our certificate of incorporation, and now it's time to put together the governing documents so that you can operate. So in New York State, all nonprofit organizations must have what's called a conflict of interest policy. In brief, and we actually have done seminars on what is on conflicts of interest, et cetera, but in brief, what a conflict of interest is that when you're in a key position in a nonprofit, so let's say I'm the founder of the nonprofit, and a decision comes before the nonprofit as to from which I could personally benefit. Let's say I'm the founder of a nonprofit and I have a catering business, or I own a bakery, and we're providing recreational services, and we want to provide baked goods at one of our games. So if the nonprofit is buying those baked goods from my bakery, right, that is a conflict of interest. Now let's do another example. Let's say that for instance, I'm an attorney and I provide legal services and I get paid for my services. The services of the nonprofit help desk are free, but the nonprofit help desk pays me for my services. So let's say I'm not on the board of the nonprofit help desk, but if I was on the board of the nonprofit help desk, it'd be a conflict of interest because I'm getting paid by the nonprofit help desk. So I said before that these are called conflicts of interest. Now, just because it's a conflict of interest doesn't make it illegal. It's only illegal if I fail to disclose to the other members of the board and to the organization that, hey, look, there's a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest because you're going to buy my baked good, or conflict of interest because you're going to use my legal services and I get paid by the organization. And then what happens is you have to have what's called a conflict of interest policy. And most policies would say that the independent members, people who are not connected to my legal firm, or people who are not connected to my bakery in the other example I gave, who are on the board, they make the decision as to whether or not to buy the baked goods from my bakery or to utilize my legal services. And they should look to things such as, am I charging them a good rate? Is the quality perhaps, whatever it is. So again, just because something is a conflict of interest doesn't make it illegal. What's illegal is the failure to disclose it, and the failure of independent members of the board, people who are running your organization on the board of directors, from them making the decision. And because I obviously shouldn't be able to vote on whether or not I get paid $50 an hour or $75 an hour, or whether or not the organization is going to utilize my legal services. That should be a decision which is made by the independent members. So again, New York State, all nonprofit organizations must have a conflict of interest policy. In New York State, all nonprofits must have a whistleblower policy if they have 20 or more employees, or they have revenue of $1 million or more. It's still a good idea for every nonprofit to have a whistleblower. And a whistleblower policy is just exactly what it sounds like. We probably all have heard about whistleblower policies. You hear about whistleblower protections. So what that means basically is that the organization should have a policy that says if somebody who works for the organization, or it could be somebody outside as well, thinks the organization is doing something wrong, who do they report it to? Who in the organization should they report it to? Or which governmental agency should they report the potential or the alleged wrongdoing? And also, how does the organization address the allegation? So the first policy we're talking about is a conflict of interest policy. That's a requirement in New York State, regardless of the size of the organization. Second, every organization should have as a best practice a whistleblower policy. Third is every organization as a best practice should have a banking policy. The banking policy says who's going to be on the bank accounts, how many signatures are necessary in order to write a check. Is there a policy that says that if it's a check under $500, one signature? If it's a check over $500, two signatures. Whatever the policy, whatever makes sense for the organization. Also, depending upon the type, that's called a banking policy. Depending upon the type of organization, it may be prudent, maybe a good idea to have what's called a document retention policy. That's the number of years that an organization has to maintain, hard copies of its records or computerized copies of its records. It's so much easier now with the internet. You can imagine years ago when not-for-profit said, well, we're going to keep our banking records for 7 years, and they have 5 or 6 different accounts. They have these massive files in their offices. Obviously nowadays with all these online resource tools, you can literally just create Google Drives and store all the important documents. Now, the next thing we do, or simultaneous with this, is we obtain a federal, I think I skipped that slide by mistake, a federal tax identification number, and that's called an EIN. It has a number of names. We think of it as the Social Security number or the tax ID number for the nonprofit. So and that's done through the IRS. It also can be done online. It is free. You obtain the federal tax ID number in New York State. New York State, unlike other states, does not have a separate tax ID number. So New York State, you utilize one number for each. And you also sometimes have to register that number with New York City if you're going to be providing certain services within New York City. So again, we're talking about a federal tax ID number. That's just the ID number. That's done before we submit our application for your charitable 501c3 letter. That same number is utilized by the state. It's utilized by the Division of Taxation, the New York State Department of Taxation. It's utilized also for state sales tax exemption, which we'll talk about in a few moments. And it's also utilized if you're conducting any kind of business in New York City. It's the same exact number, so it actually makes it easier. Now, after we have all of this done, we have your policies, and your board of directors has approved your policies and your corporate policies. And I neglected to mention, I went a little fast over that slide. The most important policy we're going to create for your organization is called the bylaws. Think of this. So the certificate of incorporation is your general document, your organizing document, and your bylaws are your operational document, are your operational rules. The bylaws specify how many officers you're going to have. Are you going to have the bare minimum in New York State, which would be a president or chairman, and then a secretary or treasurer? Or are you going to have more officers? How many directors are you going to have for your nonprofit? How often is the board of the nonprofit going to meet? In New York State, you're required to have at least one annual meeting of the board of directors of a nonprofit, but you could have more. You might specify in your bylaws, that you meet quarterly, monthly, twice a year. How are decisions going to be made? Most simple decisions are made by majority vote, right? But you might say that we want decisions. Some people want to put in their bylaws that you can't change the certificate. You cannot make an amendment to the bylaws. You can't change the bylaws, or you cannot amend your certificate of incorporation unless you have 2/3 of the voting members of the board, or 3/4, or 75%, of the board. Those are all items which go into your bylaws. And of course, if we are working with you and establishing your nonprofit organization, we as part of the service, we do your bylaws, we do your conflict of interest, we do your whistleblower, and we discuss with you various options as to what can go into these documents, so the documents are tailored for the specific needs of the charitable organization which you are creating. So now we have all these documents, and we're now ready to apply for 501c3 status. Okay. There are two potential applications for 501c3 status. The actual application is called an IRS Form 1023, and there's a 1023 regular and the 1023 EZ. Now, in the EZ form, the filing fee is $275, and I should have mentioned that while the Nonprofit Help Desk does not charge for any legal services, so we don't charge for my time or any, the consultant's times, etc., you do have to pay the filing fees. So that state filing fee that we talked about for filing a certificate of incorporation, which is $75, plus the fee to expedite it, plus if you want to get a certified copy, another $10. So that would be $110 if you're getting 24-hour service. That is a fee that you would have to pay, that the client has to pay. That's not a fee that the Nonprofit Help Desk picks up. All the legal work, yes, but not the filing fees. The same thing is with the IRS. The IRS filing fee for what's called the 1023 EZ, also called the 1023 short form, is $275. You are eligible to apply for that form. You use that form for your application for 501c3 status if you anticipate that in each of the first 3 years of the life of the organization, you're going to raise under $50,000. So if you anticipate in the first 3 years of the organization, you are not going to raise more than $50,000 in each year, you're eligible to use the 1023 EZ form. If not, you use the 1023 regular form, for which the filing fee is $600. The real significant difference here is the processing time. The EZ forms generally average under 30 days turnaround, whereas the 1023 regular form, the law says 180 days, that they have 180 days, but I've seen them go recently as long as 8 months. And the way it works with all these 1023 forms is that they're done online through a website, through a government website, and it's submitted online. Then it goes to some kind of magic portal where it's assigned to various regional offices. Or as an attorney, or if you're doing it on your own, you don't have a say as to which regional office it goes to. Sometimes, if you're fortunate, it gets sent to a regional office, which is not a regional field office of the Internal Revenue Service, which is not as busy as others, and you get a much faster turnaround. So I've had turnarounds on 1023, is in 60 days sometimes. But the average really, if you go to the IRS website and you look for that, you'll see the average is really 6 to 8 months. And as I said, that has a lot, that frankly has to do with which office it goes to. Okay, next. Here's a new requirement that many are unaware of, that as of January 1st, 2024, there's something called the Corporate Transparency Act, which requires nonprofits which have not yet obtained their 501c3 status to file an online form called the Beneficial Ownership Information Form. Basically indicating a little bit about a very simple form, a little bit about the nonprofit organization. And then, of course, once you have if you don't get your 501c3 status, which which if you do it through the Nonprofit Help Desk, you definitely, I can't promise, but we've never had one, in 35 years of doing this, which has not obtained it. But after you obtain your 501c3 status, you then do another form online. And again, if you're using the Nonprofit Help Desk, we help you. We help you with all of this stuff. You do another form online, to report that you're now exempt from future filings. So basically, if you're a for-profit corporation, an LLC, or a regular C corporation or an S corporation, you have to, the federal government wants to know the ownership and the control. This was done as part of, I'm not an expert. This is not my area of expertise, but basically what I'm sharing you can just Google yourself. This was done to in order to lessen the possibility of money laundering and funding of terrorism and all that kind of stuff. So you have to fill out these forms, etc. Now, you got your letter. You get your all-important 501c3 letter, either because we did the EZ form and you get it. I will say the fastest we've ever had one, the record in the NonProfit HelpDesk is 4 days. We had one that we submitted and we got the letter in 4 days after I submitted it online. That was a record and that was a 1023 EZ. So, but whether you've had to wait 6 months, 4 days, 30 days, we now have your 501c3 letter in hand. What next? Well, assuming you're going to, if you're going to be buying any goods, you want to be, if you're doing the recreational, the sports thing, and you want to buy footballs or baseballs or softballs, and you want to go into a store, or you're buying it on Amazon, you want to try to avoid state sales tax. And the way you can be exempt from that is it's called filling out a form with a CT-247. It's free of charge, and you and also a ST-119.2. And with that, you obtain sales tax exemption. So you are not required to pay sales tax on purchases that you make for the nonprofit. Okay. You also, if your nonprofit, in the future, is going to apply for is going to own property and you don't want to pay property taxes, you can also apply for, which is something which we help with as well, through the New York City Department of Finance. You can apply for property tax exemption. Again, your nonprofit has to own the relevant property. Next, your next step is all nonprofits in New York State are required to be registered with the Charities Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. And there's an initial form which one completes called a Char 410, and then there's an annual form called a Char 500, which is completed. And similar to the IRS, so let's talk about this for a moment. I mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation that when you decide to create a charity, there are certain maintenance that has to be done on both a state level and a federal level on an annual basis. Now, depending upon how much money you raise each year after your initial filing with the state, and also after you obtain your 501c3 status from the IRS, depending upon how much money you raise each year will depend upon the type of documentation and the returns that have to be filed both with the IRS and with the state of New York. So, for instance, if you raise for the IRS, let's talk about that first. For the federal government, each year, an individual has to file a tax return, either a 1040 regular, a 1040 EZ. Well, it's the same thing is true of a nonprofit. Think of the nonprofit as a person, or as a legal, it is a legal entity. Every year it must file a tax return. How much information is part of that tax return is determined by how much money the nonprofit raises. So, if the nonprofit raises under $50,000 a year, then it's basically called a 990 EZ. It's done online and it's a postcard and it asks you 3 or 4 questions and that's it. So if you raise under $50,000 a year, it's called a 990 EZ. This is for the federal government once again. If you raise between more than $50,000 but under $250,000, it's a 990 regular, which is a 4-page form. And if you raise more than $250,000, then it's a 990. It's more of an expanded form. It's a full 990. And by the way, I got the names wrong. For the IRS, it's called a 990N. 990N, which means 990N note card. If you raise under $50,000, it's a 990 EZ if you raise between $50,000 and $250,000, and it's a 990 regular IRS form if you raise more than $250,000. And obviously, the more you raise, the more complex and the more detailed financial information the IRS is requesting. On a New York State level, you require, as I started before and then segued into the federal stuff, you must file what's called a Char 410. And as long as you anticipate your organization is going to raise more than $25,000, you must file a Char 410. And if you're not sure, we always file the 410. And then on an annual basis, you file, depending upon how much money, a form, depending upon how much money you raise. If you raise under $25,000, you know, it's a simplified process. If you raise more, it's more complex. I thought I would show you. These are all done online now. So the filing of a Char 410 is done online. They no longer accept paper forms, but the actual physical document that you get is this form. It's very, very simple. So it's going to ask you online for your organization. And basically, when you fill out the online document, it basically populates the form for you and creates the form and files it with the state. It will ask you to upload your certificate of incorporation, your bylaws, other governing documents such as your conflict of interest form, your whistleblower form, of course, that all important IRS letter. They will ask you as part of the program to write a brief description of the mission of the organization and also to write a brief description of how you will utilize charitable funds raised by the organization. It is signed electronically by the president or your chairman or another authorized officer, and by your chief financial officer or for larger organizations which have those, or your treasurer, you know, whoever's in charge of the finances of the organization. And it will obviously ask for the names and the titles of your and home addresses of your board of directors. So that's the Char 500. Now, the Char that on an annual basis, you will be doing something called, hold on, please, I'm sorry, doing something called a Char 410. And the Char 410 will ask you to confirm the different types of the information that would to ask whether or not anything changed in your initial Char 400, and then it will ask you how much money you raised, and then depending upon the amount of money you raise in a given year, will determine the types of questions and the types of that they're going to ask you, and how much detail you're going to have to provide to the New York State, including a copy of your 990 sometimes. And if you're raising over a certain amount of money, New York State requires financial statements, either an accountant's compilation or even a higher level than that called a certified audit from an accounting firm. Okay, so this concludes the PowerPoint portion of the presentation. And now I'd be very happy, apologize. What are you seeing? Sorry, guys. Second, please. Stop share. Okay. I'd be very happy to answer any questions, and I'm just trying to see how. Let me go through them. Sorry. Ina, you're still on, please?
Yes, I'm still here.
You want to help me with if there's any questions?
Sure.
Hannah Davidson asked, okay, so if we're going to incorporate in Georgia, and we've done 2 of those, not the NonProfit HelpDesk, Hannah has to prove this obviously, but we've done 2 incorporations in Georgia before. So basically everything that I said is relevant, except you know, there are differences, you know, slight differences, because you want to have bylaws which are compliant with Georgia state law, not New York state law. But right. If you can almost just substitute New York for Georgia, all the federal stuff is the same. The filing of the 990, you know, the 1023 form to obtain a tax exempt, that's all the same. So where it changes is that the Georgia form and what Georgia requires in its initial initial incorporation papers is slightly different. But they're going to want a brief mission statement. They're going to want to know who's starting the organization. They're going to want to know. They're going to want a registered agent, the same way. And Georgia is going to want on an annual basis a form. Not nearly as complex, I will tell you, not nearly as complex as the Char 500, or the, which is done on an annual basis, but they are going to want some type of documentation submitted on an annual basis there.
Right. I did put an additional comment on the side chat asking if it can be a PO box when you're putting the address at the registered agent.
So that depends upon the state. It will work.
Okay.
It will work in New York State.
Okay.
I won't answer for another state because I just don't have the files in front of me, but we can answer that if you email us.
Great. Thank you.
In some states, it doesn't work. So for instance, Delaware, I know offhand, does not allow PO. Delaware, it must be a physical, it doesn't have to be a physical office, but it has to be a physical residence and not a virtual situation where you're receiving something at a mailing center or a PO box. Hold on, let me see if there's any other questions.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Ms. Davis, 1 second. Are these fees for the form same for all states? Yes, they are the same.
There was another question saying, is the Form 410 filed every year?
Yes. No, 410 is filed once. That is your initial registration with the New York State Office of the Attorney General. You only file a revised 410 if you have an amendment. And then I think it's called a 410A. So that would be, so you're amending, your registration filing because you've changed your officers or directors. But if you're not changing your officers or directors and you don't have new corporate policies, then your 410 remains the same. And every year you file a Char 500. That obviously changes from year to year. Hold on. I'm just looking through the chat to see if I'm missing any questions. So 410 is filed every year. Okay. Okay. Can you explain how a nonprofit daycare works? So that's a little bit beyond the scope of this, and I want to allow other people. I mean, we can do that offline if you like. But there are two different models in New York State and New York City. On daycare, there are for-profit models of daycare, and there are nonprofit models of daycare centers. And you can get recognition from the IRS as a daycare center, and obtain 501c3 status. But I think that question, Lucy, is just a bit beyond the scope of this presentation. Happy to do it offline. So I'm sorry, hi Davis, Ms. Davis, I cut you off before.
It's okay. I was wondering, excuse me, are nonprofits required to have the labor law chart?
Yes. All the
Even
labor,
even though no one is getting paid?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
So if you're a nonprofit and you're required to have, you're required to pay minimum wage, you're required to pay overtime, any postings that are legally required to be visible for your employees, if you have employees or if you have an office, are required. And you are correct that there are all these different, once you incorporate, you'll be bombarded because they just take it from the state. So that means you'll get lots and lots of letters offering you, pay $70 and you get a poster of everything that you're required and you put it on the wall. You're not required. A lot of those services are, they're not scams. I won't call them like scams, but they make it seem like you have to buy their service and you don't have to. And that's a very common question I get after we've incorporated someone is, oh, I got all these letters saying that I need to register my nonprofit with the New York State, Division of Taxation. And they want $150 to do that. Well, no, you don't need to do that. There's just an 800 number that you dial, and you tell them the name of your corporation, and you tell them your tax identification, your federal tax identification number, and then you're registered with the state. You don't need to pay somebody to register your nonprofit with the New York State Division of Taxation, or you don't need to necessarily utilize and get one of these, these beautiful, these laminated charts that go on a wall. You can literally go to the State Department of Labor website and print out what you need to put on the wall and print it out and put it yourself. It doesn't have to be some type of fancy glossy document, in terms of that.
Great, even better. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Other questions? Happy to help. So I will close by saying we did it. I wasn't sure we could do this in an hour. We did it in the hour, including the questions. I'll close by a promotional for the wonderful services of the NPHD. in terms of if you need help with anything dealing with nonprofits, don't be shy. You can go to the website of the NPHD, and you can, complete the form in requesting services. And those services include help with incorporating a nonprofit corporation, creating the required corporate documents, which we described before, the bylaws, conflict of interest, whistleblower, any other policies necessary for your not-for-profit, as well as applying for the 501c3 status for your not-for-profit corporation, and the initial filings with the with New York State. We also do the application for this New York State sales tax exemption. And in certain instances, we even show you, we don't do your tax filings on an annual basis, but we will help you with your first tax filing, because we think that once we show, if it's a smaller not-for-profit, once we've shown you how to do it, you'll be able to do it in the future, which has been our experience.
Mr. Schulman, there was a question here. Someone said that I filed for a nonprofit and paid all service fees and did the easy, but I haven't received anything in the mail. It's been over a month. How do I check on the status?
Okay, if you email me, if you email the NonProfit HelpDesk and they forward it to me, if you email me the name of your organization and and your tax identification number, I'll check on the status for you.
Thank you.
That was ZU, Zoom user. Okay, are there any other questions?
There is another question. If any organization hires an employee who does catering for its fundraiser, is it considered a conflict of interest?
So it depends upon the role of the employee. Is the employee defined in New York State, if it's New York State Corporation, as a key employee? If the employee is defined as a key person, if the employee is a key person, then yes, it would be a conflict of interest. But I want to remind you, it doesn't make it illegal. You often find that, so in your example, you have an employee whose wife has a catering business, and they're providing a great job for the organization, and they're also providing a great deal for the organization. You're getting a better deal than you would get in the open market. So as long as that key employee, that key employee has made it clear to the management of the organization or to the board of the organization that there is a conflict of interest because I'm providing, my wife or myself, whatever, we're providing the catering services, we're being paid for it. And as long as that key person, that employee is not involved in the decision whether or not to utilize, I'm using my example, the wife's service as a caterer, then you're okay. Now, what types of things might the other independent members, the management and the board or the board of directors look at in deciding this, whether or not to use the catering services, are exactly what I said. Is the quality better? Is the price better? We have experience, or there's special unique requests. Those are all things that one would consider. Obviously, just because, this should be logical, but so I have a catering business, and if I'm charging 25% more for no good reason, it doesn't help that the board approved it, or that the management approved it, because you're required to look to see whether or not it's beneficial for the organization, and it would not be beneficial in most instances for the organization to pay 25% more for catering. So, Antonio, I'm not sure if that answered your question. Okay, are there any other questions?
I don't see any more.
Thank you, everyone. Again, if you have any questions or you require services, feel free to reach out to the NonProfit HelpDesk.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Bye now, everyone.